All right, so we're back with another deep dive. You guys sent us in some really interesting stuff.
Yeah.
And this one, it's coming from the National Archives.
Right.
And it's essentially a memo that's talking about a response that the agency had to give to the House Select Committee on Assassinations.
The HSCA.
The HSCA. And
Yeah.
so we're going to go through this and see,
Yeah.
what we can pull out of it that might be,
Worth noting.
worth noting.
Exactly. Yeah. This document basically outlines the agency's response to the HSCA's request for information.
Right.
On 19 individuals, what we're looking at are summaries from their central records.
Right.
The CCS files for 5 of those individuals.
Yeah.
And I think it's worth noting that these files are really focused on employment and significantly what they term cover.
Okay. So let's start out with Mrs. G. Stanley Brown.
Right.
The memo says that there's 4 documents for her. Her real name is Bernadine Stubbins Brown.
Interesting.
She's born in 1928 in Oklahoma, and she was the wife of George Stanley Brown. And it says that she was employed by the agency in Fargo, Oklahoma, for a couple of years in the early 1950s.
Yeah.
So it seems like pretty straightforward employment history there.
Yeah. It seems to be pretty standard information at this point.
Right.
But let's look at David E. Murphy now. There's
Okay.
quite a bit more here, about 100 documents.
Wow.
And the memo points out that these documents mainly relate to the establishment, maintenance, and use of cover
Okay.
throughout his agency career, which spanned from 1948 to 1975.
Wow.
And there's also a forwarding address in Tampa, Florida in 1971.
So now this is where things are starting to get a little bit interesting.
Yeah.
We have Grayston Lynch
Okay.
with approximately 60 documents.
Right.
And again, the focus is on the establishment, maintenance, and use of cover.
It's interesting.
Yeah, his career with the agency was from 1961 to 1971, and he also retired to Tampa, Florida in 1971. So we're seeing this kind of repeated emphasis on cover and also this Florida connection. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
When we think about the HSCA and we're thinking about, assassinations and things like that,
Yeah.
The fact that cover is being repeatedly noted for these individuals, that becomes potentially significant.
Right.
It suggests that these individuals may have been involved in activities or operations
Right.
where concealing their true identities and affiliations was essential.
Yeah.
Creating false identities, misleading employment histories, things like that.
Right, yeah.
So that becomes something to definitely consider.
Okay, so let's move on to Robert Moore.
Okay.
About 50 documents for him. He was born in Mississippi in 1913.
Right.
And he was with the agency from 1950 to 1967.
Gotcha.
And not surprisingly, the records concern the establishment and use of cover.
Of course.
During his time at the agency, he also had assignments in Miami, Florida between 1961 and 1964.
Interesting.
And a forwarding address in 1970 is noted as well. So
Another Florida link.
yeah, another Florida link.
Yeah.
And again, this recurring theme of cover.
Exactly. It's not an isolated incident.
Right.
This is, a consistent thread across these records that the agency clearly, deemed important to report.
Right, yeah. And then there's Bill Harvey.
Okay.
His real name was William Joseph Harvey. He was born in Chicago in 1912,
Okay.
and he was with the agency from 1947 to 1972.
Right.
And his roughly 25 documents also primarily concern the establishment, maintenance, and use of cover.
Interesting.
And his last noted forwarding address was in Chevy Chase, Maryland. So we have 5 individuals with records, and 4 of them have this cover detail highlighted.
And the memo actually points out that there's no information on the other 14 individuals
Right.
that the HSCA inquired about in these CCS files.
Right.
So that absence of records could be just as noteworthy.
Yeah, so what's the takeaway here? You
Yeah.
know, we have records for these 5 people.
Yeah.
And for 4 of them, this repeated mention of establishment, maintenance, and use of cover really stands out. Yeah.
Why was this detail, so consistently flagged?
Well, it raises an important question, right?
Yeah.
About the nature of their roles within the agency.
Right.
I mean, cover isn't just about, general secrecy.
Right.
In the context of an investigation into assassinations,
Yeah.
it strongly implies a need to conceal their activities,
Yeah.
potentially in very sensitive areas.
Right. Okay. So to kind of sum this all up, the documents that were sent in show that the agency had information on 5 out of these 19 people that the HSCA was interested in.
Right.
And a key feature of those records is this repeated emphasis on cover for 4 of them.
Exactly.
Along with some interesting Florida connections.
Yeah, for sure.
For the other 14, there's nothing in these files.
Precisely. And it leaves you to consider, why were these specific individuals of interest to the HSCA?
Right.
What might that consistent notation of cover have suggested to the committee regarding their, potential knowledge or involvement in things?
Yeah. What kind of operations necessitate that kind of elaborate concealment?
Right.
And what larger questions does that raise for you about the agency's work during that period?
Yeah, great questions.
Yeah.
Well, that's about all the time we have for this deep dive. But as always, thank you so much for tuning in.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this was a really interesting one. So until next time.